I want to go over the water standards for harmonized GAP plans. We're going to look at field operations, harvesting, and post-harvesting as well. All right. So again, I want to acknowledge my cohorts. These folks with the University of Maryland, ALEI, and MDA and Extension are always willing to help you out in any of these issues with water on your pond or any other issues concerning food safety. So please call on us. We like that. All right. So this talk has been extracted from the USDA Harmonized GAP Standard, and that is the recently updated, all right, as of February 8th, 2021 standard. And we have a URL there that you can go and look at the standards and the checklists for yourself. And of course, we can help you with that also. All right. So as Shirley talked about, generic E. coli is the indicator that we use. And I'd like to put that kind of in perspective, although Shirley's information certainly indicates that there's a lot more for us to know. But what we measure through our testing is generic E. coli. And generic E. coli is a part of the total coliforms and the fecal coliforms. So what that tells us is when we have high generic E. coli is that we have presence of fecal material. And I think the takeaway from what Shirley said and what this slide illustrates is that total E. coli levels that are high, you know you've got fecal material contamination. So you have an increased risk. So I want to talk a little bit about the harmonized GAP standards, and we're going to start off in the section F, which is our field standards specifically for field operations. And I want to start out with F-3, which is water system description. Now, just to review what Angela said last week and Molly said a few weeks before, we have some little hieroglyphics here that tell you just exactly what each section, or what your obligation with each section is going to be. So WP indicates that a written plan is necessary. M I've used to indicate something that is mandatory. R indicates that a record must be kept, a log must be kept. And A stands for risk assessment needed. So we do actually have in the water standard for harmonized GAP, we have 2 risk assessments that must be done. So let's start off with F3.1, which states a water system description shall be available for review. This is a written plan is necessary and it is mandatory. So what you're going to want here is a description that includes all of your sources and their distribution networks. You're going to want to indicate flow. You can use maps as I did up here in the upper right-hand corner. This is a capture from Google Maps and then overlaid with, I know it's a little tiny, but you can see the piping here, you can see the water sources, and the flow would be indicated with little arrows. So maps, drawings, photographs, written descriptions, just make sure it is complete and accurate. Make sure you get down to the nitty-gritty with all of the fixtures and valves and gates, reservoirs, water capture systems. You want the whole thing there for the auditor to take a look at. Now, for your help, besides contacting Angela and I directly, we have a YouTube video of a webinar that we did on water distribution systems last summer, and also an article here in the newsletter that should help you through it. So going on to F3.2 states that the water source shall be in compliance with prevailing regulations. Now notice, no written plan, no records, and it is not mandatory, but it is certainly a good idea to do. And what this boils down to is that installation water systems meet the state and county codes, and the system is applicable for their use. Going on to F3.3, water systems shall not be cross-connected with human or animal waste systems, and this is mandatory. So what I've illustrated here, and this is actually the mildest of many illustrations that Alec has shared with me, you have a condensation line that the operator of this facility very tidily put into a floor drain. And that's a great idea. right? Because it keeps the water, the condensate water, off of the floor, which we don't want. There's many, many risks associated with that. And this works fine until the drain backs up. And now you have contaminated water going back into your condensate line, and that's a risk that you don't want to take. So be careful on these shortcuts that you might take. It might get you into trouble down the line. It can be a risk. So going on to F4, this is where you do a water system risk assessment. Now, if you tuned in last week, Angela did a fabulous job on going over what a risk assessment means. So 4.1 states, an initial risk assessment shall be performed and documented that takes into the historical testing results of the water source. So here your testing records, the history of those tests, it's going to be very, very important. Hang on to those. You want to consider in your risk assessment the characteristics of the crop, the stage of the crop, and the method of water application. So this has the symbol A for assessment, and it is mandatory. So just to review, this is a slide from last week. So the basics of a risk assessment, you want to look at the situation. What is the hazard? What is the likelihood of the hazard taking place? If it takes place, what is the likelihood that the crop will be affected? And what can you do now to prevent the hazard if possible? And then if something occurs, what remediation steps am I going to take? So that's your basic risk assessment that you're going to want to do on your water system. What's more important, or most important, is to remember that things change on the farm. You introduce a new crop, you reorganize the irrigation to a different field, you need to do repairs, you add maybe extra equipment. Each time you make a change, your risk assessment needs to be reviewed and updated to reflect those changes. So going on to F5, this is a master management plan. So F5.1 says that there shall be a water management plan to mitigate risks associated with the water system on an ongoing basis. Notice that this is a written plan is required and it is mandatory. Now, this is, if you've been to a produce safety rule training, you might remember that this is a recommendation of the produce safety rule plan, all right? But it is not a requirement. So your water management plan is going to include your preventative controls, your monitoring and your verification, your corrective actions and the documentations, and then think about your crop stage, the application of your irrigation water, the timing. Those should be included in your water management plan, because through method of application and timing of application, your risk may actually be fairly low. Again, anytime that a change occurs in your water distribution system, or you go to an alternative water source, your management plan needs to reflect that change. And this is one area where you probably want to also keep worker training records, because if your workers are involved in the water management plan, you're going to want to make sure that they're trained in these techniques that you require, and that training documentation needs to be put in here. Okay, moving on to F5.2. Water testing shall be a part of the water management plan as directed by the water risk assessments. Now, your risk assessment and your management plan will dovetail, and in water testing, this is one place where they do. And it goes on to say the current industry standards or prevailing regulations for the commodities being grown. So here we have a written plan is necessary and it is mandatory. Here you're going to want to include frequency. Who takes the water sample? Where is it taken? As well as the results. Moving on to F.3, the testing program shall be implemented consistent with the water management plan. So this is a record required and it is mandatory. So the bottom line in F5.3 is be consistent. You've got a risk assessment, you've got a management plan, and now your testing program has got to be consistent with what you've said you're going to do. So that's where this comes in. Moving on to F5.4, If water is treated to meet microbiological criteria, all right, and a lot of people do, the treatment is approved and effective for its intended use and is appropriately monitored. So here we have record required, and this is mandatory. And I've taken a moment with this slide to show you we do have sample water monitoring logs. These templates are on our website and they're available in several other sources. So something like this, whether it's a written record or it's maintained electronically, you probably want to alter it to meet your farm's requirements and make sure you put your farm name and location and contact information on the top and make sure that it is signed off. Here is an illustration of a test strip that is being used to measure levels of chlorine. So if you are MDA HGAP certified, you're already familiar with this particular step. So here, harmonized HGAP is pretty much just the same as the MDA HGAP. So make sure that you keep your records in your binder. Your treatment is described, and you are using your sanitizer according to label use. Make sure that your sanitizer is labeled for food contact. Going on to 5.5, if post-harvest handling is used to achieve microbial criteria, operation has documentation supporting its use. So again, here we have a record required, and it is mandatory. And what this is referring to is using environmental conditions to reduce your risk of your pathogenic microbes being on your crop. So here we're looking at reduction by half log per day of sunny weather, and that's using ultraviolet light and sun and environmental conditions to reduce that possible microbial load on your crop. Now, what records are you going to need to establish this? So you're going to want things like your last irrigation, when was it, what your potential log reduction is over time. Did you have sunny weather for 4 days? Hopefully you did if you're going to use this technique. The dates harvested, was the product stored, was commercial washing used, and what dates was washing applied to this. So this also aligns with Produce Safety Rule, section 112.45B1. So here, if you've had Produce Safety Rule training, this is where harmonized HGAP aligns with it. So moving on to F5.6, if operation uses an alternative approach to regulatory and microbiological testing, operation has scientific data or information to support the alternative. And here, if you're going to go in that direction, you will need supporting documentation. And this is also falls under a similar rule under the Produce Safety Rule. So let's move on to F10. This is where water or ice is used in the harvesting and post-harvest operation. So F10.1, operation has procedures for water used in contact with product or food contact surfaces. And here, written plan is required. You have to have the documentation showing that you are using your written plan as written, and this is mandatory. So this is the section where you're going to have your water monitoring, standard operating procedures, your water change schedules, your record use of test strips, and any temperature monitoring if that is applicable for the sanitizer used, if used. So again, this is aligned with the Produce Safety Rule when it states that water use must be safe and must be maintained or managed in a safe manner. Going on to F10.2, water use SOPs address the microbial quality of water or ice that directly contacts the harvested crop or is used on food contact surfaces. And here, record is required and it is mandatory. So again, this is going to be where you have your water test in your pack house, determining its potability, records indicating where, if you use ice, where is your ice sourced from? Is it manufactured on site? Was it transported? And was it stored under sanitary conditions? So this is where you have to illustrate the fact that if you're using ice or using water cooling, that all of those checkpoints can be answered. Moving on to F10.3, if water is reused, now this is going to be referring to like your dunk tank water, SOPs address antimicrobial treatment. Here a record is required, and this is mandatory. So now you're looking at your treatment and monitoring records. You want detailed SOPs to fall under this section. And again, this falls under the produce safety section, where water must be maintained in a safe manner. So you're already probably doing this. Just make sure you have those monitoring records that will support those SOPs. F10.4, water use SOPs address the condition and maintenance of the water delivery system. Now, we talked about having water delivery system on the total farm. So if you forgot to do it in the packing house, this is where it really says you've got to have that water delivery system illustrated in your pack house or wherever you're handling your product post-harvest. So record is required here. For both of these things, you might want to make a supplementary checklist. That might be a good way of organizing your delivery systems, both the larger delivery system on the farm and the smaller and no less important delivery system in the packing house, because you do need to have records, and this is mandatory. So your SOPs might include things like maintenance of the sand filter, repair or maintenance of pipes, valves, any of those things that are in your water delivery system that would influence the quality of that water. So things like maybe cleaning schedule for watering tanks might fall in here too. So going on to F10.5, if applicable to the specific commodity, water use SOPs address control of wash water temperature. Now this is specific for a couple of commodities where we know that we can have hot cantaloupes come in off the field and go into a cold dunk tank. This image shows that when you have that situation, that you have potential infiltration through the skin of the cantaloupe. So this lope has been immersed, hot from the field, into cooler dunk tank water with a dye in it. So that shows that you've got infiltration. So we know that occurs specifically in tomatoes and melons, and this aligns with the Produce Safety Rules section 112.48C. So that you want your written record that shows that water temperature has been monitored for those situations. Now let's move on to the post-harvest section. That's our P section in our harmonized HGAP checklist. And P7 is on post-harvest water and ice use. So this is very similar to F3, but now we're getting specific for that pack house. So P7.1 states that a water system description shall be prepared. So this is specific for your packing house operation. It's going to include your water system description, regardless of whether you're using groundwater or municipal water, okay? So both groundwater and municipal water would be something that you would definitely want to describe the system. Again, records required, and it is mandatory. So F7.2 details documented scheduled assessment of water system, including delivery equipment, shall be performed. So this is going to be records, and it is mandatory, where you have maintenance of things like, did you install backflow prevention valves on all of your spigots and your water use faucets and such? You're going to want to have a record of routine inspection. When the auditor comes, having a record of routine inspection shows your due diligence that you actually looked at your water delivery system, and you're aware of the fact that you might have issues that might occur. Things like leaks. Leaks, if water gets out, water can get into your system and it can be an entry point for contamination. So this is records required and it is mandatory. Going on to P 7.3, water use SOPs address the microbial quality of water or ice that directly contacts the harvested crop or is used in food contact surfaces. And I'm going to point out that cleaning and sanitizing of food contact surfaces is going to require potable water. So just pointing that out to you. So here we have a record required and it is mandatory. And things that would fall under this section would be your testing records for municipal and groundwater. And also this has a produce safety rule aligned that is produce safety aligned. All right. P 7.4 operations food safety plan includes produce washing process if used. Now we've got that A again. A risk assessment is required in this case, particularly if the commodity is in a high risk area, such as melons and tomatoes, that monitoring and records are appropriate for those particular commodities. But in general, you're going to want a risk assessment, all right, of your wash process, a written plan, and this is mandatory. So again, you have the second risk assessment for your water system. Going on to 7.5, if used, water antimicrobial treatments shall be monitored sufficiently to assure continuous control. Record required, and it is mandatory. So this is frequency of your antimicrobial treatments. What kind of antimicrobial treatment did you use? And you want those SOPs to correlate to your water management plan. All right, F 7.6, reused water, and that's going to be your dunk tank, that contacts product or food contact surfaces shall be treated with using an approved antimicrobial process or chemical treatment. Now, this is mandatory. Records are not required, but the auditor who is on your facility would probably look for evidence to make sure that this is being done. So 7.6, you want to have the label for the type of antimicrobial product that you use. You want to make sure that your records that are previously mentioned are appropriate to the use of the product that's being used in accordance to label directions. So all of that, even though you don't have a written record in this particular segment, it goes back to some of the previous, or reflects back to some of the previous points about your antimicrobial process. P 7.7, operation has documentation demonstrating regulatory approval of the wash water antimicrobials in use. And again, what this refers to is that the antimicrobial product, the sanitizer that you're using, must be EPA approved for food contact, and that does align with the Produce Safety Alliance. So going on to 7.8, if wash water antimicrobial is used, it shall be used in accordance with established operational procedure and manufacturer instructions, record required. That just makes sure that your records support the written plan on antimicrobial use and that your antimicrobial use is being used in accordance to the label direction. And this is aligned with the produce safety rule. So if you're produce safety rule, if you're following the produce safety rule, this is right along with that. All right, P 7.9, if applicable to the specific commodity, all right, now we're getting specific commodities, water use SOPs address the control of immersion water temperature. So again, this reflects back to the similar section under field process. It talks about where you've got that hot product, particularly we know about tomatoes and cantaloupe, and you can get potential infiltration of your dunk tank water. So your monitoring records of your temperature will need to be in place, and definitely have SOPs for your workers to follow so that make sure that this is getting done. P7-10 water change schedule shall be developed for all uses of water where water is reused. And again, we're talking about that dunk tank. And even though no record is required, it is not mandatory, we have the previous sections that are requiring SOPs. So again, your SOPs would be required in some of the previous sections. So no record required, but the auditor will be looking for that. And to finish up, P7.11, debris, damaged, and or visibly contaminated produce shall be removed from wash areas and dump tanks to the extent possible. So again, it would be nice in your main plan to have SOPs that reflect this need to remove that extra material, and the auditor will look for observable compliance. And if there are any questions I can answer, I'd be happy to. But remember that Angela and I are available. We love going over harmonized HGAP standards with our individual farmers. So please take advantage of our offer.